1. The Forgotten Town. Forsyth County, Georgia. Forsyth County, Georgia. A small town, a forgotten place. But it holds a dark secret, one buried deep in the history of this land. It's a name most people outside of Georgia have never heard. But for Black Americans, Forsyth represents a painful chapter that refuses to fade into the past. In the early 20th century, Forsyth County wasn't just a quiet rural town. It was a place where Black families once thrived. But that all changed in a single night. A night that would change the course of history and forever scar the community that lived here. In 1912, a Black man named Rob Edwards was accused of assaulting a white woman named Maybelle Allen. The allegations were never proven. In fact, there was no real evidence to support the claim. But in a town steeped in racial tension, evidence didn't matter. What mattered was fear. Fear of Black people gaining power. Fear of Black people living beside white people in peace. And so, in that volatile climate, the narrative was clear. The Black man must pay. What followed was pure terror. The Black community, living peacefully in Forsyth County, was forced to flee, driven from their homes by an enraged white mob that carried torches and pitchforks. In a matter of days, Forsyth was cleansed of Black residents. Families were forced to abandon their homes, their businesses, their lives. They left in a rush, with no time to pack, no time to say goodbye. But Forsyth didn't just erase Black people. It erased their history, too. The buildings they once owned, the schools their children attended, the churches where they worshipped, they were all abandoned, turned into relics of a forgotten time. What replaced them? New developments? New neighborhoods? White neighborhoods? The history of Forsyth's Black residents was scrubbed from the land, as if it had never existed. In 1987, after decades of silence, a Black man named Theodore Ted L. Brown attempted to run for office in Forsyth. He was met with violent opposition, attacked by white residents, chased from town, and silenced once again. Forsyth had learned nothing from its violent past. The ghosts of its history still haunted the streets, and the town refused to allow Black people back in. Today, Forsyth County remains nearly 90% white. It's the epitome of the American South, proud yet stubborn. It's a town where history is carefully forgotten, where the painful past is swept under the rug. But if you listen carefully, the whispers of that past are still here. They're in the streets, in the politics, in the way people talk about race, about who belongs and who doesn't. But here's the truth that Forsyth doesn't want you to know. The violence never truly stopped. It just evolved. It became quieter, more insidious. Instead of outright lynchings, it became economic displacement. Instead of mobs chasing Black families out, it became the systematic removal of affordable housing. Instead of racial terror in the streets, it became the destruction of Black communities through zoning laws and gentrification. In Forsyth, the very idea of Black people being able to exist in peace, without the constant weight of oppression hanging over them, has been suffocated. It's not enough for white residents to simply exist here. Black people must be erased, their presence erased, their story erased. For decades, Forsyth County has held on to its racist past. And while the world around it has changed, this town has remained frozen in time, clinging to ideologies and actions that have no place in a progressive society. And so, the question remains, what happens when a town refuses to change? When it actively fights against the idea of integration and equality? What does that say about the people who live there? Forsyth County is a place where racism isn't just part of the past, it's part of the present. And unless we face that truth, Unless we reckon with the past and its painful legacy, this town, and so many others like it, will never change. 2. The Forgotten Borderland, Lake County, Indiana. Lake County, Indiana, a place once teeming with industry, hope, and promise. A place where the American dream was supposed to be within reach for everyone. But for Black Americans, this county tells a very different story. A story of broken promises, hidden hatred, and relentless oppression. Lake County's story begins in the early 1900s. During the Great Migration, Black families left the horrors of the South in search of better opportunities in the North. They believed they would find sanctuary in places like Chicago, Detroit, and other industrial cities. Lake County, just outside of Chicago, became a destination, a beacon of possibility. But what these families didn't realize was that the promises of the North were often just as hollow as those of the South. By the 1920s, the Black population in Lake County was growing, and with it, so was the resistance to their presence. Black families had started to make a home for themselves, but that didn't sit well with many white residents. The so-called N-word towns emerged, places where Black families were encouraged to live, isolated and segregated. The streets they lived on were treated as second class, neglected by local government, ignored by public services, and targeted by racism that permeated every aspect of life. But the most disturbing aspect of Lake County's racism wasn't just the poverty it bred, it was the violence that simmered beneath the surface. In the 1920s, after Black people began settling in the area, white mobs attacked their neighborhoods. African Americans were forced out through intimidation, and entire blocks of Black-owned homes were burned to the ground. It wasn't just about where Black people could live. It was about making sure they couldn't live anywhere in peace. And so, the migration of Black Americans to Lake County turned into a nightmare. While whites continued to build wealth, Black people struggled in the face of both overt racism and systemic oppression. As the 20th century wore on, things didn't get better. They got worse. Despite their labor in the mills and factories, the people of Lake County were trapped in a cycle of poverty, discrimination, and violence. Today, Lake County remains one of the most segregated and racially tense places in America. Though Black people fought hard to integrate and make their voices heard, the scars of the past remain deeply embedded. The county's history of racism is still alive and well, festering under the surface of its decaying industrial landscape. And though there have been attempts at progress, the long-standing divide between Black and white residents continues to shape the county's present. And here's the truth no one talks about. Lake County's racism didn't just remain in the past. It became the foundation for the economic and social systems that continue to harm Black people today. While gentrification and corporate development were meant to revitalize the county, they only displaced Black families further. Affordable housing has been replaced by high-end condos, and jobs in the factories, once a symbol of Black economic power, have been replaced by low-wage, dead-end work. And the question remains, who benefits when Black families are forced out of their homes? Who benefits when entire neighborhoods are razed to make way for development that only serves the wealthy? Lake County's legacy is a legacy of struggle, a place where Black people have fought and continue to fight for their lives, their dignity, and their place in the world. But for too long, that fight has been ignored. The county has tried to move forward, but the weight of its past holds it back. Lake County is a place where history hasn't just shaped the present. It continues to cast a long shadow over the future. In Lake County, the battle isn't over. The ghosts of racism and violence haven't faded away. They've evolved, taking new forms. It's not just about the factory jobs that have disappeared. It's about the erasure of Black history, the continued violence in the form of police brutality, and the economic exile of black families who have been pushed out once again. Lake County is a place where history repeats itself, and where black people continue to resist. In this forgotten borderland, the story of racism is far from finished. And the question we must all ask ourselves is this: how much longer will we allow it to persist? 3. Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri. A small town once overlooked by the rest of the nation. It could have been just another quiet suburb, a place where families live out their days in peace. But in 2014, Ferguson became something else entirely. It became a flashpoint, a symbol for Black America's ongoing struggle against police brutality and systemic racism. It all started with a moment, an incident that in many ways could have been any day in America. Michael Brown, a young black man, was shot and killed by Officer Darren Wilson in broad daylight. Brown was unarmed. He was 18 years old, and he was left to die in the street, in the middle of a suburban neighborhood, for hours, his body exposed to the world as a chilling symbol of a nation's failure. But the story of Ferguson doesn't start with Michael Brown. It begins with decades of tension, decades of resentment built on the systemic racism that permeates every aspect of this community. From the schools to the courts, from the police force to the city council. Ferguson, like so many other towns, was a microcosm of the racial injustice faced by Black Americans across the country. The problems in Ferguson had been building for years. Long before the shooting of Michael Brown, Black residents had been calling out the police department for targeting them, for stopping them without cause, for subjecting them to constant harassment. Black people in Ferguson lived under the shadow of police presence every single day. They had seen their neighbors arrested, assaulted, and criminalized for simply existing in their own community. And when the shooting happened, it wasn't just the tragic loss of a life. It was the culmination of everything Black residents of Ferguson had been fighting against. The anger, the pain, and the fear that had been buried for so long finally exploded. But what followed was even more shocking than the incident itself. The response from the police department, heavily armed, militarized, and hostile, only further confirmed what the people already knew. In Ferguson, Black lives didn't matter. The militarized response was a message from the very institutions that were supposed to protect the people they served. Instead of peacekeepers, they became the aggressors. They showed up with rifles, tear gas, armored vehicles, and a mandate to control, not protect. It was clear that Ferguson was not the exception. It was the rule, a microcosm of what Black Americans experience across the country. Constant surveillance, constant criminalization, constant fear. What happened in Ferguson was not just a local issue, it was a nationwide reckoning. The Black Lives Matter movement was born from the fires that ignited on those streets. Ferguson became a rallying cry, a call to action, a demand for justice. And the world watched. They saw what Black people had known all along, that the systems of power, from the police to the courts to the media, were designed to maintain white supremacy and protect the status quo. And yet, even after the protests, even after the world's attention turned to Ferguson, the fight was far from over. The police officer who killed Michael Brown was not charged with murder. The systems that allowed the injustice to happen remained intact. And the people of Ferguson, still reeling from the loss, were left to pick up the pieces of a broken community. Ferguson was just the beginning. It was the spark that ignited a fire. And now, that fire burns brighter than ever. But the question remains, will we let it burn out, Or will we keep fighting for the justice that Ferguson and so many other communities deserve? 4. Charleston, South Carolina, the legacy of slavery. Charleston, South Carolina, a city steeped in history, known for its southern charm and old-world elegance. But beneath the surface, beneath the facade of antebellum grandeur, lies a history of racial terror that shaped this city and the entire nation. Charleston was once the largest slave port in the United States. It is where the blood of enslaved Africans was spilled, where families were torn apart, and where the seeds of systemic racism were planted. The city's connection to slavery is undeniable. From the late 1600s to the Civil War, Charleston's economy was built on the backs of enslaved black people. In fact, over 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to the United States passed through Charleston's ports. The wealth generated from the labor of black people fed the city's elite, who built their fortunes and their reputations on the exploitation of human beings. But Charleston's legacy doesn't end with slavery. It is a legacy that continues to affect the city's black residents today. The wealth of the city may have shifted, but the racial divide remains just as wide. In 2015, a tragedy would remind the nation that the scars of slavery have not healed. A young white man named Dylan Roof walked into Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, a historically black church, and opened fire, killing 9 black worshippers in cold blood. Roof's attack was not just an act of violence, it was a symbol of the ongoing hatred that festers in Charleston, a hatred rooted in centuries of racial oppression. The city may have changed, but its undercurrent of racism remains. The fact that a white man could enter a black church, a sacred space, and murder 9 people without hesitation speaks to a larger truth, a truth that Charleston, like so many other cities, has yet to confront. But Charleston's racial divide isn't just about the past, it's about the present. The city remains one of the most segregated in the country, with deep disparities in wealth, education, and health care. While the city's tourist industry thrives, black residents continue to face economic hardships, limited access to quality education, and a strained relationship with law enforcement. The same city that celebrates its history also turns a blind eye to the suffering of its black citizens. In recent years, Charleston has tried to confront its past. The city has acknowledged the pain of slavery and segregation, and some efforts have been made to rectify the wrongs of history. But even as Charleston seeks reconciliation, the deep-seated racism that lingers in the city remains a problem that no one seems willing to fully address. The monuments to the Confederacy that still stand in Charleston streets are a constant reminder of this unresolved tension. Charleston's refusal to fully reckon with its racist past leaves black residents caught between 2 worlds, one that celebrates its antebellum history and another that continues to oppress them. The monuments, the history, the systems, everything in Charleston points to a harsh reality. The past is never really gone. It lingers, festers, and continues to shape the present. But there is hope. There are those who refuse to remain silent, who refuse to accept the status quo. In Charleston, as in other cities, the fight for justice continues. The younger generations are demanding more. They are challenging the systems of oppression that still exist, and they are refusing to let the horrors of the past define their future. Charleston may be one of the oldest cities in America, but it is also one of the most haunted. The ghosts of slavery still linger in the streets, in the monuments, in the systems that continue to oppress black people. But the city's black residents, their resilience, and their fight for justice prove that the legacy of slavery does not have to define them. They are writing a new chapter in Charleston's history, one where the past does not have to dictate the future. Charleston, South Carolina. a city divided by its history, but unified by the fight for justice. And as long as there are those who are willing to stand up, to speak out, and to demand change, the shadows of the past will never fully darken the future. 5. Tulsa, Oklahoma, the ghosts of the Greenwood District. Tulsa, Oklahoma. At first glance, this city may seem like any other in the American heartland, a place of industry, culture, and progress. But beneath its polished surface lies a history of racial terror, one that still resonates in the Black community today. For many, Tulsa represents both the height of Black prosperity and the depths of racial violence. It is a city haunted by the ghosts of the past, where Black success was violently erased in a matter of hours. In the early 20th century, the Greenwood District in Tulsa was a thriving hub for Black success. Black doctors, lawyers, businessmen, and educators lived and worked here. It was a place where Black people were not only surviving, but thriving. In fact, Greenwood was often referred to as Black Wall Street, due to its unprecedented economic prosperity and the wealth it generated for its residents. But in 1921, everything changed. It was here in Tulsa that one of the deadliest acts of racial violence in American history unfolded. A white mob, spurred by false accusations of a Black man assaulting a white woman, descended on the Greenwood District. In the span of just 18 hours, over 1,000 Black homes and businesses were destroyed, and as many as 300 Black residents were murdered. The Tulsa Race Massacre, as it became known, was an event so horrific that it was largely erased from the history books. The city's authorities, in collusion with white supremacist groups, covered up the scale of the massacre, and many of the survivors were left without justice or compensation. Those who lost everything were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, while the perpetrators faced no consequences. In fact, many of the Black residents who survived were forced to leave Tulsa altogether, their lives upended by a single act of racial terror. What happened in Tulsa was not an isolated incident. It was a part of a much larger pattern of racial violence that ravaged Black communities across the country. But Tulsa stands out not only for the brutal scale of the massacre, but for the way it was forgotten, buried by the very people who were supposed to protect the victims. It wasn't just the physical destruction that was erased, but the memory of what happened. For decades, the story of Black Wall Street's demise was silenced, ignored by the press and by the people in power. In recent years, the massacre has gained national attention, but the fight for justice continues. In 2021, the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, the city's leaders finally acknowledged the tragedy in a public ceremony. Yet, the question remains: will the survivors and their families ever receive justice for the lives lost and the community destroyed? Tulsa, Oklahoma, is a city still reeling from the effects of the massacre. A city where Black prosperity was snuffed out in a single day, and where generations of Black Tulsans continue to feel the repercussions of that violence. The wounds of 1921 have never fully healed, and the fight for reparations and justice remains ongoing. As the city remembers its past, it must also confront the present. A present where Black residents continue to face systemic racism in housing, education, and employment. But despite the pain, there is resilience. The descendants of the survivors, along with local activists, are fighting for a future where the lessons of the past are not forgotten. They are demanding justice, not just for the massacre, but for the ongoing struggle for racial equality. Their fight is not just about reclaiming a neighborhood, it's about reclaiming a history that was stolen from them. Tulsa, Oklahoma, a city that once embodied the height of Black prosperity and the depths of racial violence. A city that is still coming to terms with its past. A city where the fight for justice is far from over. The memory of the Tulsa Race Massacre may have been erased for a time, but the truth is emerging once again, as the survivors' descendants and the community refuse to let history repeat itself. The question now is whether the rest of the country will listen, and whether Tulsa will finally confront the legacy of its past. Before we continue, like this video, subscribe to stay informed and share it with others. We must continue this conversation. We must continue to fight for a better future. And we need your voice. Stand up, speak out, and help create the change we desperately need. Together, we can build a country that lives up to the promise of equality for all. Next up, 6. Charleston, South Carolina. The deep-rooted legacy of slavery. Charleston, South Carolina, a city that represents the beauty and complexity of America's Southern history. To the untrained eye, it might seem like a charming historic place, a city full of old-world charm and elegance. But beneath the beauty of its antebellum architecture and its picturesque harbor lies a history of racial violence, inequality, and oppression that stretches back centuries. This city's history is built on the backs of enslaved Africans. Charleston was once the epicenter of the transatlantic slave trade. More enslaved people were brought through Charleston's port than any other city in the United States. The city's wealth, its culture, and its very identity were shaped by the exploitation of black people. Forced labor in cotton fields, rice plantations, and tobacco farms. In 1860, just before the Civil War, Charleston was home to the highest concentration of enslaved Africans in the country. The city's economy thrived on human suffering, with enslaved people working the fields, the docks, and the plantations, providing the wealth that the city's elite would spend on mansions and fine living. For generations, Charleston's economy and way of life were defined by the exploitation and dehumanization of black people. But the city's history isn't just a relic of the past. It's a living, breathing part of Charleston today. The legacy of slavery has been passed down through the generations, manifesting in economic disparity, systemic racism, and continued racial tension. Though Charleston today may not resemble the city of the 19th century, the scars of slavery still remain etched in its fabric. In Charleston today, the legacy of racism is seen in the way black residents still face systemic inequities. The wealth gap between black and white residents is vast. Black families in Charleston are more likely to live in poverty, have limited access to quality education, and face barriers to employment. Meanwhile, the city's elite continue to profit off the very history that has marginalized the black community. But Charleston's racist history is not just about the economic divide, it's also about the deep cultural wounds that remain. The city's monuments and public spaces often honor the men who fought to preserve slavery and segregation, while the history of black Charlestonians is relegated to the margins. Monuments to Confederate generals stand tall in public squares, their presence a constant reminder of a time when black lives were considered less than human. The question many in Charleston ask is, how long will these symbols of white supremacy remain in plain sight? The debate over Confederate monuments has divided the city. Some argue that they are a part of the city's history, while others see them as symbols of oppression that must be torn down. But no matter where one stands on the issue, the fact remains that these monuments continue to cast a long shadow over the black community in Charleston. The continued presence of these monuments raises another troubling question. In a city that has seen so much racial violence, why is the pain of black people so often ignored? Why is it that the descendants of the very people who were once enslaved are still fighting for recognition, for reparations, and for justice? But even in the face of this history, Charleston's black community remains resilient. The city has long been a hub for black culture, and in recent years, young black leaders have begun to take control of their own narrative. They are fighting to reclaim their history, to uplift their community, and to demand justice for the wrongs of the past. From organizing protests to working on policies for affordable housing and educational equity. Black Charlestonians are fighting for a future where their community can thrive. Charleston may be a city deeply marked by its history of slavery, but it is also a city where the fight for racial justice and equality is far from over. The black community in Charleston refuses to be silenced. They are determined to ensure that the injustices of the past are not forgotten, and that the voices of black Charlestonians are heard and respected. The battle for a just and equitable future is ongoing, but it is one that the people of Charleston will continue to fight, no matter the cost. Charleston, South Carolina, a city built on the blood and sweat of enslaved Africans, and a city that continues to reckon with its legacy of racism. It is a city where the fight for justice is far from over, but where the spirit of resistance and resilience is alive and well. The question remains, will Charleston's painful past finally be acknowledged and atoned for? The answer lies in the hands of those who refuse to let history repeat itself. 7. Tennessee, the battle over civil rights and racial divides. Tennessee, a state whose name is synonymous with music, culture, and history. But beneath the melodies of its music scene and the charm of its southern hospitality lies a troubling legacy of racial violence, segregation, and ongoing struggles for black equality. From the 19th century to today, Tennessee has been at the heart of the battle for civil rights, a battleground where black residents have fought and continue to fight for justice and recognition. In the mid-20th century, Memphis became a flashpoint in the civil rights movement. The city was the site of some of the most pivotal events in the struggle for racial equality, including the tragic assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Dr. King was in Memphis to support striking sanitation workers, many of whom were black, and fighting for better working conditions and fair wages. His death marked a dark chapter in Tennessee's history, but it also served as a rallying cry for change. The assassination of Dr. King was a brutal reminder of how deeply entrenched racism and violence were in Tennessee. It also highlighted the dangers that black activists and ordinary citizens faced as they sought to dismantle the systems of oppression that had been in place for generations. Though Dr. King's death sparked a wave of protests and activism across the nation, Memphis and Tennessee as a whole would continue to grapple with the lingering effects of racism for years to come. Today, Memphis remains a city where the legacy of segregation is felt every day. Black residents continue to face systemic inequalities in housing, employment, education, and health care. The city's schools are still highly segregated, and black students often face lower graduation rates and fewer opportunities for advancement. In the workforce, black workers are disproportionately concentrated in low-wage jobs, and many face discrimination when seeking higher-paying positions. These disparities are not accidental. They are the direct result of decades of institutional racism that continue to haunt Memphis and the rest of Tennessee. But the inequalities in Tennessee are not limited to Memphis alone. Across the state, black communities are still grappling with the weight of a history that refuses to be forgotten. From Nashville to Chattanooga to Knoxville, racism continues to manifest in both overt and subtle ways. While some parts of the state have made progress, particularly in the field of education and public policy, Tennessee remains a state where racial divisions run deep. The fight for justice in Tennessee is ongoing. In 2020, protests erupted across the state In response to the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other black individuals at the hands of law enforcement, in Nashville, hundreds of people gathered to demand police reform and an end to systemic racism. While some lawmakers listened to these calls for change, others fought to maintain the status quo, and much of the legislation that would have addressed these inequities failed to pass. The black community in Tennessee has been on the front lines of this struggle for years. Whether it's pushing for educational equity, advocating for criminal justice reform, or demanding better access to health care, black Tennesseans continue to fight for a future where they are treated with dignity and respect. But the road to equality is long, and the fight is far from over. Despite the challenges, Tennessee's black community continues to push forward. In cities like Memphis, local organizations and grassroots movements are working tirelessly to uplift their neighborhoods and advocate for policy changes that address racial inequality. Young leaders are emerging, determined to make their voices heard and to create a better future for the next generation. The fight for civil rights in Tennessee may have begun over half a century ago, but it continues today, and it will continue tomorrow. In Tennessee, the struggle for racial justice is far from over. But the people who live here, black and white alike, are not backing down. The battle for equality is one that will continue to shape the future of this state for generations to come. And though the road ahead is long, one thing is clear. Tennessee's black community will keep fighting, keep advocating, and keep pushing for the justice they deserve. The question is, will the rest of Tennessee stand with them? Or will they continue to allow the racial divides of the past to dictate the future? 8. Louisiana. The legacy of slavery and modern-day segregation. Louisiana. A state with rich cultural traditions, vibrant music, and a cuisine that's as diverse as its people. From the swamps of the bayou to the lively streets of New Orleans, this is a place where history lives and breathes in every corner. But Louisiana's history is also one of pain, suffering, and division. A history that, for many black residents, never really left. For centuries, Louisiana was at the center of the South's plantation economy, an economy built on the backs of enslaved black people. The state's plantations were vast, stretching across the fertile land of the Mississippi Delta. Here, black bodies were treated as property, as tools for profit. The legacy of that exploitation has left an indelible mark on the state, and its effects continue to echo through the generations. After the Civil War and the end of slavery, Louisiana became a battleground for black rights. The state's black population was left to rebuild from the ashes of slavery, only to face the resurgence of white supremacy in the form of segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence. For decades, Jim Crow laws kept black residents in a state of subjugation, legally and socially. But the story of racial inequality in Louisiana is far from over. Today, Louisiana remains one of the most racially divided states in the country. While New Orleans is a cultural hub, much of the state's black population still faces challenges that are rooted in its troubled history. Louisiana's black communities are disproportionately affected by poverty, poor education, and a criminal justice system that often fails them. Louisiana's public education system remains one of the worst in the nation, with predominantly black schools receiving fewer resources and less funding. The achievement gap between black and white students continues to grow, with black children often attending schools that are overcrowded, underfunded, and lacking in essential resources. This system, designed to keep black students in the margins, continues to perpetuate a cycle of poverty and inequality. The criminal justice system in Louisiana is another area where racial inequities are glaring. Louisiana has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, and black people are disproportionately affected. In a state with a long history of racial violence, the prison system has become a modern-day form of control, targeting black communities at alarming rates. More than 70% of Louisiana's incarcerated population is black, a staggering statistic that reveals the deep racial disparities in the state's criminal justice system. From over-policing in black neighborhoods to racial profiling and sentencing disparities, the criminal justice system in Louisiana continues to disproportionately affect black people. In many ways, it mirrors the segregation and disenfranchisement of the past. The stories of black families torn apart by the criminal justice system are countless in Louisiana. These families live with the trauma of knowing that their loved ones may never have a fair chance at justice. The racial profiling, the over-policing, and the mass incarceration are not isolated incidents. They are the result of a long history of racial oppression that continues to haunt the state. But despite the overwhelming odds, Louisiana's black community continues to fight back. Activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens are organizing to demand justice, equal rights, and fair treatment. From protest movements to grassroots initiatives, black Louisianans are standing up and demanding the state live up to its promises of equality and justice. In New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and other cities across Louisiana, the fight for justice is ongoing. Young black activists are challenging the systems that have kept them oppressed for so long, demanding changes to policing, education, and economic inequality. They know the road to progress will be long, but they are ready to fight for a future where all Louisianans, regardless of race, can live free from fear and oppression. Louisiana's fight for racial justice is not over. The state may have a dark and painful history, but its future is still being written. The legacy of slavery, segregation, and racial violence may never be fully erased, but Louisiana's black community continues to rise above the obstacles that have been put in their path. They will not be silenced, and they will continue to push for change, not just for themselves, but for future generations. 9. Mississippi, the deep-rooted legacy of hate. Mississippi, the birthplace of the civil rights movement. The state where the blood of young black men and women soaked the soil, and the cries for justice echoed through the streets. But despite the strides made in the 20th century, Mississippi remains one of the most racially divided states in the Union, a state where the battle for equality is still very much alive. The echoes of Mississippi's history can still be heard today. This was the place where Medgar Evers, a civil rights leader, was assassinated. It was the place where the bodies of 3 young activists were found in a shallow grave, their lives stolen by white supremacists trying to stop the progress of black people. Mississippi has always been ground zero for the brutal, violent fight for civil rights, and the scars of that history have not healed. Today, Mississippi remains one of the poorest states in the country, and its black residents suffer the most. The state's rural areas are plagued by high unemployment, low education rates, and a lack of access to basic services. But beyond the poverty, it is the systemic racism that keeps black Mississippians oppressed, as though the old plantation economy is still in place. Mississippi is a state where the Confederate flag is still proudly displayed in many areas. A symbol of white supremacy and the state's resistance to civil rights, the flag has been a contentious issue for decades. In some towns, it's not just a flag, it's a badge of honor for those who refuse to acknowledge the sins of the past and present. The white supremacist ideology in Mississippi is still alive, and it often masquerades as heritage. Confederate flags and statues still dot the landscape, not as relics of history, but as symbols of defiance. Defiance against the progress of black Mississippians and the larger civil rights movement. It's a constant reminder that for many in this state, racial division is something to be celebrated, not mourned. But in the face of this deep-seated racism, Mississippi's Black community has endured. It is here that the civil rights movement found its heartbeat, and it is here that the fight for equality continues today. In churches, in community centers, and on the streets, Black Mississippians are pushing back against the systems that oppress them. The young people of Mississippi are leading the charge for change. They are not content to sit back and let the state's history of violence and hate define their future. They are organizing protests, demanding justice for victims of police brutality, and fighting for a better education system for Black children. They know that the fight for racial equality is long and hard, but they also know that they are not fighting it alone. Mississippi may be a state steeped in hatred and division, but it is also a place where the fight for justice is ongoing. The people of Mississippi, especially its Black residents, are not backing down. They know the battle is far from over, but they are determined to push forward, to reclaim their state, their history, and their future. Mississippi's legacy of hate cannot be erased, but it does not define the future. The people of Mississippi, Black and white, are part of a story that is still being written. And while the battle for racial equality in this state is far from won, it is a battle that will continue to shape the nation as a whole. 10. Alabama, the heart of resistance and change. Alabama, a state whose very name echoes through the halls of history, both for the horrors inflicted upon Black people and for the courageous resistance that was born here. It's a state that was once the heart of the Confederacy, where blood was spilled on the streets of Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, as Black Americans fought for the right to vote, to be treated as equals, to exist without fear. This was the birthplace of the modern civil rights movement. It was in Montgomery that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott, which laid the foundation for the powerful struggle that would follow. It was in Selma where the infamous Bloody Sunday took place, and where the courageous March for Voting Rights forever changed the nation. These events, etched into the history of Alabama, are reminders of the fierce resistance to racial oppression. But despite the victories of the civil rights movement, Alabama remains a state where Black people continue to face significant challenges. Today, Alabama remains one of the most racially segregated states in the country. Its Black residents face some of the highest rates of poverty, unemployment, and inadequate education in the nation. The streets of Birmingham, once home to steel mills that employed thousands of Black workers, are now riddled with disinvestment. Public schools are underfunded, and the criminal justice system disproportionately targets Black Alabamians. In Alabama, the fight for equal education continues. Black children are often stuck in overcrowded, underfunded schools, while the state's wealthier, predominantly white areas receive better funding and better facilities. This inequality perpetuates the cycle of poverty, making it nearly impossible for many Black families to escape the harsh reality of systemic racism. But perhaps the most visible injustice in Alabama is its criminal justice system. The state has the highest incarceration rate of Black people in the country. From racial profiling to sentencing disparities, the system is designed to keep Black Alabamians trapped in a cycle of oppression. And while reforms have been made, the fight for true justice remains a battle. But even in the face of these overwhelming odds, Alabama's Black community continues to fight back. The spirit of resistance, so deeply rooted in the state's history, lives on in the young activists demanding change. From the halls of government to the streets of Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, the fight for equality is still alive. And it's growing. Alabama may be a state with a painful past, but it is also a state of resilience and renewal. The new black leaders of Alabama, entrepreneurs, activists, educators, are working tirelessly to reshape their communities, to create a new future. They are demanding change, building businesses, and creating spaces where black people can thrive. In every corner of Alabama, there are voices rising up, voices demanding change. The future of Alabama is being shaped by its black residents who refuse to let the weight of history define them. They know that the fight is far from over, but they also know that change is possible, and it's coming. Alabama's fight for racial justice may have begun with bloodshed, but it will not end in defeat. The legacy of resistance runs deep, and today, the next chapter is being written by those who refuse to accept the status quo. Together, they are pushing Alabama and the entire nation toward a future where equality is not just a dream, but a reality. If you've watched this journey through the 10 most racist places in America and heard the stories of resilience, resistance, and the fight for equality, now it's your turn to make a difference. Don't let these stories end here. Share this video, comment your thoughts below, and let the world know that racism has no place in this country. Like this video, subscribe to stay informed, and share it with others. We must continue this conversation. We must continue to fight for a better future. And we need your voice. Stand up, speak out, and help create the change we desperately need. Together, we can build a country that lives up to the promise of equality for all. The fight isn't over, but if we stand together, we will win. Share your thoughts, and let's keep this conversation alive. The time for change is now.